Yes, friends, on a Monday, it's OGP, the one giant podcast. You know it. We're your host, Adam Armbrecht over here, Andy Makowitz over there, who I assume is healthy, wealthy, and wise, making sure that his family is healthy, wealthy, and wise.
Oh, Adam, family party over the weekend. All of a sudden, my son wakes up with a fever this morning,
Sure.
102, go to the doctor. They're like, good news, not COVID related. Bad news, definitely confirmed that you have the flu, which is great for any parent out there that knows daycare now is out the window for the next couple of days. So you're looking at daddy daycare at home whenever I'm not recording OGP.
There's multiple movies about that, though, so you should be okay. I think you pop those on, you get some pro tips, and then you just kind of take them. I think to a cabin somewhere was their big thing in the sequel. That's the follow up. Obviously, that's Cuba Gooding Jr. We're not talking about the Eddie Murphy vehicle. Bottom line is, though, as we come back in, it's the 11th of April. We know just 2 weeks away, essentially a little more than that, from the NFL draft getting underway. And so we begin our look around the New York Football Giants, what's currently on their roster at every position, and how they can look to improve it through the draft in a couple of weeks. And Andy, we kick it off right at what I think is a sexy position, wide receiver. We're going to be referring to this all the way through as position view, the wide receiver room. Andy, where do we stand as we look down the barrel of the draft and what the Giants want to accomplish for the short and long term?
Yeah, so the first thing that we do is obviously take a read of the room, as you so elegantly put it, and just see, what do the Giants have today? What is the state of the union? Obviously, it starts with two or three main names, but we'll start with our big last year's offseason acquisition in Kenny Golladay. Kenny Golladay is making $18 million a year, had a terrible season last year to the point where all Giant fans were basically like, how quickly can we get out of this contract? The fans didn't really like how he was approaching it. He was injury prone before he got here, has been injured for his career. Now, Adam, specifically around Kenny Golladay, he's the one that's making the most money. He's the one that we want to talk about off the top. What I find interesting about Kenny Golladay, so he signs for about $18 million a year. Everyone says it's a massive overpay. And then you have this like wide receiver bonanza that happens this recent offseason. He went from being the 5th highest paid wide receiver in the league to the 12th highest paid in a matter of like a month. And so when you start thinking about it, Adam, like, he could end up being the 15th, 16th highest paid wide receiver in the league before the league year even starts, or before game one. And when you think about guys like DK Metcalf, who are asking for $30 million, Deebo Samuel wants $35 million a year, does Kenny Galladay's albatross contract now start looking a little bit more cost effective?
No, not yet. I think, listen, we get into the season and Kenny Golladay, what is Kenny Golladay, right? I mean, the reason why we talk about it being so expensive, it's not even the contract. I mean, you would go back to, you and I were not a big fan of the signing at the time, but okay, now he's a part of the team. Let's get him out there. Whoops-a-daisy. He has injury issues, something that has followed him for the last couple of seasons. So the question is he out there and is he healthy? Because being the 12th highest paid wide receiver is still too much money if you're only going to play in 40% of the games. Now, in theory, if he's out there and he's healthy, do I think that number, well, let's put it this way. Do I think that he can give you top 12 production at the position? Probably not. So I still don't think he's ever going to live up to the value of that contract, because you're going to see younger players around the league overcome that, rookie classes, rookie contracts, etc. But if this is a guy that can give you, we can get to that 1,000-yard receiving range, if we can get 65 receptions on the season, if we can get a guy that's playing in at least 14 games in the upcoming year, right? Like, those are the benchmarks. And I wouldn't even go into the touchdown kind of aspect of it, because there's 1,000 different ways to have success on the offensive side of the ball. But it starts with health. If he's not going to be healthy, then any amount of money that you're paying Kenny Golladay is still going to be too much money.
I mean, it's not good when you think about all of our different like positional players that are most important. It's like Daniel Jones. Is he injury prone? Let's look back at history. Kenny Golladay, your biggest free agent acquisition. Is he injury prone? Can he stay healthy? Your number 2 overall pick, gold jacket wearing Saquon Barkley. Like, it's not a good sign when all of these people have, injury concerns. I don't know if other teams feel that way, but certainly for the Giants, yeah, it's tough. Kenny Golladay, listen, the one thing I will say that's interesting is we looked at last year, complete debacle anyway. So who cares that we spent $18 million on Kenny Golladay? If we spent $14 million on him and had $4 extra million, it wouldn't have changed whether the Giants made the playoffs or not. Right. So like, what I will say is we do have him on our team. We do have him under team control for 3 more years, Adam. And this year he's the 12th. By next year, if he can stay healthy, having 2 more years at $18 million for a wide receiver 1, like that might
Yeah.
not be the worst thing in the world.
Yeah, I don't think, while I think he can have a bounce back season, so to speak, and the bar is pretty low on that. I think Kenny Galladay's number one, status in the league, that's gone. It's the reason why even the past regime, for all of their blundering, drafted a wide receiver in the first round to hopefully be the replacement as the number one threat on this offense. We'll see how it plays itself out. But to that point, though, we also know amongst this roster, you have players like Kadarius Toney. We want to see him get into camp. We want to see what he looks like. We know the small sample size, again, injury concerns, wouldn't you know it? But an electric talent, we know that, and certainly could be very dynamic inside of Brian Dable's system, and obviously with Kafka on the offensive side. Then you get Sterling Shepard. Listen, two-second take on him. Do we think this is a chance for him to reclamate his career and get himself back on a good foot, or was it just a gesture from the Giants as his career may be coming to a close?
I think it was just a mutually beneficial decision for the Giants and Sterling Shepard to get back together for at least one more season.
Yeah.
Look, Sterling Shepard, obviously, one of the heartbeats of the Giants. I think every Giant fan roots for Sterling Shepard as one of our own draft picks, who obviously plays with his heart on his sleeve when he's out there. It's just injuries have zapped him of a lot of the availability of playing for the Giants. And so with that, Adam, I think what's in a better question is Sterling Shepard coming off an injury, Darius Slayton having an explosive breakout year a couple years ago, and then last year kind of just quietly underperformed. I think would be the best way to categorize it. Your expectations between the two of them. Who do you think has more yards and more touchdowns this year, Sterling Shepard or Darius Slayton?
Oh, well, that's a good question. Because I don't know, come to draft day, is there an offer on the table for a Darius Slayton, and the Giants look to pivot off of him in the final year of his contract, right? Like there's that piece of it. So will he even be here? I could thread the needle and take Sterling Shepard because he may be the only option actually on this roster when we get to the regular season. I would say Sterling Shepard. I mean, listen, when is he going to be healthy? When will he officially be back on the field? That's the TBD of this. But I think as we start to look into this draft here and talk about players that the Giants could bring in, let alone another position that we'll obviously discuss here, to the tight end room, right? And how they replace some players there as well. Darius Slayton could just kind of find himself as being a guy on the roster, as opposed to the way we looked at him a year or two ago as the number 2 wide receiver, maybe the grooming in process to be a real contributor to this roster. Now suddenly you look at him, you go, last year of a deal, new regime, new system, you come back in another contract? Probably not. So where does that really leave you?
Yeah, and that's a good point. And around Darius Slayton too, I believe the Giants can free up about 1.2, 1.3 million dollars if they were just to outright trade him or cut him or release him. And we know from what Joe Schoen has told us, they need to find money under every couch cushion to be able to afford, even if they tried to keep someone like James Bradbury on the roster, which is highly unlikely, they're still going to need to find money to operate throughout the year. So
Yeah.
you bring up a very good point that Darius Slayton may not be on this roster, especially because he's from the old regime. He could save them a little bit of money, and you could probably get, looking into the draft, in the mid rounds to be able to replace his production. I think on the roster still, you mentioned Kadarius Toney. I think, he's probably the last one on the roster that we think has the potential to be a major contributor here. Do you hear Joe Schoen and Brian Daboll say, we don't believe that Kadarius Toney is a tradable piece. And I would agree, because he is a freak athlete. He is a guy that is a game changer when he gets the ball in his hands. But then you have all these kind of mercurial, like awkward off-field stuff that isn't necessarily bad. Like, he's not a bad person. It's just that, it has a little rubbing the wrong way with the media, and then is not showing up to off-season workouts even though they're voluntary. It's like, is there something to be concerned with Kadarius Toney here, or do you think week 1 he's out there and everyone will forget all this noise that's gone on in the preseason?
Week 1, he's out there, and I think everyone forgets about all the noise that's gone on. You know what I mean? And we talked about it, right? The voluntary show up to the facility, could only do walkthroughs, no real conditioning, only meeting with trainers, no coaching staff, and he wasn't there for it. And again, do your ears perk up when you hear that? Yes. And also, will you even remember that sentence when it's week 1 and he takes a 4-yard, crossing route from Daniel Jones and rips it for 75 yards. No, he's still an elite talent. Remember, I'll hang my hat on what Joe Schoen said when he first came in. Got on the phone with Kadarius Toney, talked about him. He gave me some of his favorite artists. We're exchanging music. Like, I think that relationship is there to be fostered. And again, unlike, regardless of talent level, unlike a Darius Slayton, final year of his deal. Kadarius Toney just in his second year of his contract, of his rookie deal, right? And when you look around the room here right now, while he has his own injury concerns, Shepard, through trade potentially next year, Kenny Golladay, Darius Slayton, all these guys could be off this roster. Like, Kadarius Toney is the crown jewel that they could center themselves around on this offense, depending on what they accomplish in the draft. So he's going to get afforded every single opportunity to be successful, to get on the right foot and be a part of this organization.
Well, and you heard Brian Daboll come out and say, in the wide receiver room specifically, we looked back at tape from Kenny Golladay at the Lions. We looked back at tape from young Joka from, the University of Florida, because we wanted to see different ways to utilize him. Basically, a backhanded way of saying, I don't know what scheme they were running with Jason Garrett, but it wasn't maximizing their value. Let me go find someone that did. But yeah, I'm excited for Kadarius Toney week 1. I think, like we said, all this noise is just that. It's noise, because when you see the talent that he has in the game against Dallas, where he's making Trayvon Diggs and other cornerbacks look silly with the types of routes and athleticism he has, when he gets the ball in his hands, we're all going to forget that he missed a voluntary workout on April 5th leading up to the draft.
Young, controllable talent. That's what it's about when you're turning over a regime and an organization. Let's talk about that young, controllable talent. When we look at the NFL draft and prospects that Joe Schoen may look to bring in for Brian Daboll, we know that the New York Football Giants obviously are going to be coming into the draft with multiple picks at the top there, 5 and 7, then 36, 67, 81, 112, 147, 173, and 182. And what we want to do, Andy, is just kind of cover the spectrum here, because I think depending on how the top of the draft goes, all those different scenarios that we'll get into as we get closer to the draft, the trade down possibilities, depending on how they handle things at the top, there's a chance that they could go and address a position of need for not just this year, but the years ahead, as we've outlined that position as early as 36 potentially. You have a prospect that you think is maybe being undervalued on a lot of draft boards. The question becomes, when should the New York Football Giants take this talent?
So let's set the scene a little bit. Everyone is talking about the 5th and the 7th pick for the Giants and where we go. And I think all Giant fans are in a consensus that
running back twice.
Yeah, running back twice.
I blacked out. What happened?
Yeah, Dave Gettleman no longer here, not on the table anymore.
Right. Yeah.
But what I will say is, everyone's saying there are other areas of need. I think Giant fans are in a consensus that, look, defensive end is probably a bigger position of need.
Defensive tackle.
Offensive tackle is probably a need. Cornerback, a little bit more of a need. Wide receiver, not so much. So when you look at guys like Chris Olave or Drake London or any of these guys that are presumably going to go in the early to mid first round, there isn't really much the Giants need to do in terms of like scouting on those guys. I just don't think that there's a world where they end up, in Giants blue. Sure. What I will say is, as you get into the second round, and you've addressed these like glaring needs in the first, it starts to open up things like wide receiver for the Giants. And, the first name that came to my mind after watching a little bit of film and reading up and looking at things is Skyy Moore. Skyy Moore out of Central Michigan is an absolute monster. And Adam, he's 5'10". He runs a lowish, 40 time. He is just a freak athlete. And just to give you a sense of that, when he was in high school, I think he grew up around Pittsburgh. When he was in high school, they basically just said, okay, you're going to play wide receiver. He said, okay, that sounds good. He went to go run a route and they overthrew him and he had to go pick up the ball on the track field. And he went to go throw it back and he threw like a 40 or 50-yard dime back to the quarterback. And they're like, you know what? You're going to play quarterback too.
Daniel Jones replacement. Understood.
Yeah. So he can play. He has the athleticism to play cornerback, wide receiver, quarterback. And he's a guy that's all over the field. His catch radius is unbelievable. Pro Football Focus ranks him as their #1 wide receiver in this whole draft. And I can see why. He does have that athleticism to play any position on the field. And when you think about it, he's a perfect candidate for the Giants. He's 5'10", so he's got reasonable size. He is an athlete like Kadarius Toney and can create a matchup nightmare for anyone. Played 66% of the time outside, played 33% in the slot, so you can move him all over the field. And Adam, it looks like, most things are saying he's anywhere between the 6th and 12th ranked wide receiver in this class.
Sure.
I have him higher than that. I think he might be the second or third best wide receiver. And it looks like he's going in either the second or the third round. I think he's someone that Giant fans should be looking at and saying, I would be very excited if he ends up, on the Giants.
Would you draft him at 36? Because that's the question. Because from everything that I've read up on him, he is an incredible talent. And maybe he is being undervalued on some boards. But the bottom line is he's not going to be there at 67. So if the Giants want him, as things stand right now, we know trades, they could have extra picks, etc. But if you're up at 36, you've gotten the offensive tackle, you've gotten the edge rusher or the cornerback in the first 2 picks in the first round there. Now you're up at 36. Do you feel like Skyy Moore is worth taking there as opposed to the other position you didn't get in the top of the draft, corner or edge rusher, or looking at a linebacker, or looking at an extra defensive edge rusher? Anything's on the board here, right? Another offensive lineman could be there at the top of the second round. Is 36 too high for Andy Makowitz to draft Skyy Moore?
It pains me to think about it because there's so many areas of need for the Giants. And the idea of drafting a linebacker or an edge rusher, if we don't get him at 5 or 6, feels like the right pick to me. And so, Adam, I've gone through this in my head. I said, well, why don't we address a different area of need and then move back up in the second round and go get him? And then I thought to myself, well, then we're trading away more draft capital
Right.
when we have all these areas of need. It's a catch-22. So my short answer is yes, I would use the 36 overall pick on Skyy Moore because we talked about the room that the Giants have in terms of their wide receivers. We don't know if Darius Slayton will even be on this roster. We know that
but Darius Slayton is your third wide receiver at best. He could even be the fourth if Sterling Shepard is healthy. So you can't look at it that way as far as he goes. I get what you're saying. Like I'm not against doing it, but I'll put it this way. Sorry. I am against doing it because the time you come up in the second round, let's just say you take offensive lineman and you take edge rusher at 5 and 7, you stay in pat, you don't get to trade back at all. At 36, it's going to either be cornerback, it could be safety, and there's a couple that are right there in the wheelhouse that could be real impact players. It's going to be potentially a defensive lineman. There's a name in there we'll get to when we get to that position that would be a real high value there. It's going to be linebacker. Like the list of value positions there are going to be pretty high. Now, and the caveat that I'll give here before we run into some other prospects here is, regardless of past regime, when they came up in the second round and Xavier McKinney was there, it was, hey, man, we didn't think this kid was going to be there. He's fallen into our lap. Best player available. You have to go get him. So if the Giants look at Skyy Moore and say, boy, is he head and shoulders above it. We had him as being the top 4 wide receiver, and he's fallen here. Then yes, I could see that scenario playing out. The ideal one for me would be then that you manage to trade Darius Slayton for a 5th round pick, that somebody for some weird reason looks at the math you talk about with Kenny Golladay and says, you know what? I'm going to go ahead and trade a 3rd or 4th round pick for Kenny Golladay. Not likely, right? But if you could get a 4th round pick for Kenny and a 5th round pick for Darius Slayton, well, maybe those assets are enough. Then you can move up the board and address other needs. The bottom line is it'd be interesting to see if they go at 36. I want to make sure here that we get to go ahead. I want to make sure we get to these other couple prospects.
Yeah. What I was going to say is, listen, it's not the ideal situation using a 2nd round pick when we have all these different areas of need. But like we said, with Darius Slayton's being a question mark on this roster, Sterling Shepard coming off of injury, Kenny Golladay from a contract from a previous regime, like it kind of feels like, you fast forward 12 months from now, and the only one that you could feasibly see on this roster could be Kadarius Toney. So it could be an area of need. But to your point, 2nd round might be a little too rich with all these other areas of need. I know you've looked a little bit deeper than maybe the 2nd round, a little bit further back. Are there a couple of prospects that maybe the Giants should be looking at later in the draft?
Yeah, I'm going to give you 4 names, but only focus on 2 of them, because when you come up at 67, there's 2 players that are right in that range. Alec Pierce out of Cincinnati, and then Justin Tolbert out of South Alabama. Now, South Alabama prospect in Justin Tolbert, I look at him, he's 6'3", as is Pierce, but he has some issues with drops coming out of it. He's listed right in that 70 to 75 range. I think he's a guy that's probably either dropping, or I would look at him dropping on my board. So if you're at 67, you'd go, well, maybe at 81, there's a value buy there. Alex Pierce, on the other hand, who could be a rising prospect and maybe won't even be there at 67. But if the Giants came up at 67, you're talking about a guy that's 6'3", ran a 4.41. He's labeled as elite deep speed. He has the strength to dominate smaller cornerbacks. He has a solid route tree combination that he can run, and he's had consistency throughout his collegiate career. The other one, a big way, was big for him, is he can play on the outside and can also move around in the formation a little bit for you. I look at him as being the heir apparent. You bring him in, you say, boom, you are ready. If Darius Slayton's on this roster, guess what? You're behind Pierce now on the hierarchy of wide receivers. If he's still there or you trade him away, another year from now, is Kenny Golladay gone? Boom, I can slide over a 6'3" wideout to replace Kenny Galladay's production. And to your point, like, you need to look at this in the short and long term and say investing in something a little bit earlier than maybe we think around the needs board could be worth it, so that you don't have to look in next year's draft and make a difficult decision. And it could be the Giants go high next year if Daniel Jones works out, another first round wideout potentially. But Alex Pierce to me is a guy that started in the 90s, 80s kind of range and has pushed up a little bit. That's my guy at 67 if you want to go there. And then if you move down the list, I'll just hit this real quick and then get your thoughts so we make sure we cover them. Later on, there's two more players here. Romario Dobbs coming out of Nevada, 6'2", 4'5", 240, 200-pounder. I like him. He's going probably in somewhere between the 81 and 112. So if he falls to 112, I think you get a value. If you were thinking about him at 81, it might be a little bit too soon. Again, solid player, gives you consistency. Literally, freshman year, came into college, gave you 41 catches, I think 700 yards, and just kept repeating and building off of that on a year-by-year basis. So I absolutely loved him. Hit me with your thoughts there before I give you my golden sleeper of the draft.
So I really, really like, well, I'll do the good and the bad. I'm not as high on Jalen Tolbert as you are.
No, I think he's falling. Yeah, he's a guy that I probably wouldn't want the Giants to draft him. From a value standpoint, you could take him at 81 and say it's a good value. I wouldn't want him for the Giants.
He's ranked in the bottom quarter of even like past, some of his catch metrics, as well as his blocking. I know you're like blocking for a wide receiver, but it is important. It just feels like he might not be the right fit. You mentioned Alec Pierce. I really, really like Alec Pierce. The RAS score, the relative athletic score, which is something that we like to use a little bit more than just Pro Football Focus grades. Out of 10, he had a 9.81. Like, he is just an athlete. And at 6'3", he's got that big size. He's kind of like what you hope Kenny Golladay would turn into. He's in the top quarter in terms of pass blocking. He's catch radius, catch percentage. He's all in the top 20 or top 25%. I really, really like him as a pick. And if he's available, in that third round with one of our third round picks, I think that could be a really good maneuver for the Giants.
Yeah, I like him a lot. I think that at 67, that would be to me the value of where you are in the draft and positional need. Because by that point, you've already gotten at least 3 out of your 4 other big needs: edge rusher, cornerback, offensive lineman, safety. Any 3 of those 4 combined there before you get to 67. And I personally could look at it and say, yeah, I feel really good about taking this wide receiver here, knowing, again, at that point too, you pick up the phone. Somebody wants Darius Slayton for a 6th rounder. You go ahead and you take that and you just roll it over for another position of need as you move through the draft. The last guy I want to touch on here, I already mentioned him once before on the draft. I'm going to mention him again here because I just feel like he's being overlooked. We use Draft Buzz on this one, which gives you the average collective ADP across a lot of different platforms. Dontario Drummond out of Ole Miss. I feel like people are sleeping on this guy. And the funny thing about it is I look down here. Now he's 6'1", 465. 215 pounds. The dude is built and uses his body like a running back. They say in descriptions, take it with the grain of salt that it's meant to be, that he has a little bit of that Deebo Samuel kind of value because he's been used in RPOs. He's been lined up on the outside. He's been lined up in the slot. He's been lined up as an H-back. He has the Swiss Army ability. And when you talk about what he's good at, the first thing they say is good at most things, just not great at any one individual spot. But he checks the boxes across the board with consistency. He's powerful, uses his speed and his strength like a running back, and again, can be utilized across the entire system. The reason why I highlight him is you just mentioned about blocking, which is not one of his strengths. He's not one of the bigger prospects. You know that I'm not huge on smaller guys. But again, 6'1" isn't tiny. His hands, 72 percentile there. Short receiving, intermediate, and deep threat routes, 87, 89, and 91. He can do it all, man. And when you go back and watch his combine, he just shows off all the athleticism and all of the skill set. Like, sometimes we said this, the eye test tells you a lot more than maybe what the statistics or the measurements are going to tell you. I just think, and he's labeled as a guy that comes in as a special teams contributor and then cracks his way into the starting lineup. I think if you drafted him this year at 173 or 181, you're going to turn around next season when some of these guys come off the roster, like Shepard, like Slayton, even if Kenny Galladay's still here, boom, you're going to have another player that gets to be utilized in tandem with Kadarius Toney, where you say, we don't know where these guys are lining up. We don't know which way they're taking the ball, and we don't know who's going to get utilized the most effective on a down and distance scenario. Ontario Drummond remains my sleeper of the draft that the Giants should be willing to take 20 or 30 picks ahead of where he's graded.
Yeah, it's interesting that you mentioned that because someone like Justin Ross from Clemson is about
It's falling,
6'3",
right?
210. He's falling, but he doesn't have the athleticism that Dontario Drummond has. So I love that pick. I think it's a sneaky one. The Giants are going to have to look to address things a little bit later in the draft. As we mentioned, second round feels a little rich. So we're going to have to find some of these diamonds in the rough, Adam.
Yeah, and we'll touch back in maybe a little bit in bonus content around Dobbs and some of these other guys. But we've given you someone at the top of the second, in the third, and then all the way back into the fifth and sixth round that the Giants could hopefully use to strengthen their roster. We're going to do this, as we said, position views all off season long here as we work towards the NFL draft. You follow us on social media. You check us out over on YouTube. Until next time, Andy Makowitz wants, needs, and nay, demands the people know.
As always, let's go Big Blue.